Across the globe, children are being treated as second class citizens, vulnerable little people who are easy to use and abuse. Yes, children are even treated as second class citizens here in America, bought, sold, and created for a price. My guest today has dedicated her life to putting an end to the commodification of children and to being an advocate for them. She's the founder and president of Them Before Us, a global movement defending children rights to their mother and father. I am so excited to have Katie on today. It's going to be an excellent episode. Hey everyone, I'm Kristan Hawkins. Welcome to the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. So my guest today is Katie Faust. She's the founder and president of Them Before Us, a global children's rights nonprofit. Between soccer, carpool, and church duties, she's a mom on a mission against progressive overreach, a global trending speaker, handshaking policy influencer. Who wrote this bio? It's amazing. And a regular contributor to a variety of conservative outlets. Katie testifies and publishes widely on controversial topics such as men and women are different and children should not be bought and sold, things that should not be controversial but sadly are today. She's helped design the teen edition of the Witherspoon Institute's CAMVOX, which studies sex, gender, marriage, and relationships from a natural law perspective. Katie, thanks so much for being on today. Before I start pestering you with questions, can you share with us just a little bit about why you started Them Before Us and what you all are currently engaged in doing?
Yeah, I started it mainly because what I heard in conversations around marriage and family, beginning with the definition of marriage when we were debating whether or not it should be man-woman marriage or man-man marriage or woman-woman marriage, was that adults were at the focus, at the center of all of those conversations. And the rights and well-being of children were secondary if they were mentioned at all. And what I heard from the pro-gay marriage camp was that kids don't care if they have two moms or two dads, which functionally means kids don't care if they've lost their mom or dad. And I've been working in youth ministry for a couple decades. I was the assistant director at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. I've got 4 kids myself. I'm currently running the youth ministry at church. I have a lot of contact with kids who have experienced all kinds of family breakdown in their life. And if there's one thing kids literally care about a lot, it is whether or not their mother or father loves them and is living with them and wants to be connected to them. So that was the first topic where I really saw sort of a weaponization of a child's greatest wounds used to advance a political aim. And then once I saw it in the marriage debate, I started to see it everywhere. So in all of these conversations, whether it is cohabitation or divorce or same-sex parenting or reproductive technologies, or even the way that we talk about adoption, all of them are very obsessively focused on what adults want. So what we're doing at Them Before Us is we are seeking to center the child in all conversations about marriage and family and prioritize their rights above the desires of adults.
What does that look like when it comes to the adoption debate? How do we have a child-centered, child rights-centered approach to adoption versus parent-centered?
Yeah, well, there's actually 2 different dangers in the adoption world right now. So the way adoption is supposed to be done, it is supposed to elevate the best interest of the child. Okay. That is the gold standard when you're talking about adoption. We've got decades of best practice here in the United States. We have international treaties that govern how adoption should take place. And all of it centers around the best interest of the child. So functionally, what that means is the child is the client in adoption. In adoption does not exist to give adults kids, not even sweet infertile couples. Adoption is not a way for adults to sort of, complete their family. If adoption is done well, every child who needs a loving home will be placed in a loving family, but not every adult who wants a kid is going to get one. The child is the client. Their needs supersede all of the adults involved. Okay, that is how you should think about adoption. So right now there's 2 dangers when it comes to how we think about adoption. One comes from one side of the debate that says adults have a right to adopt, right? So you'll have different states that are saying like LGBT adults have a right to adopt. And the answer is, from a child-centric perspective, no, you don't. Because no adult has a right to adopt. Children who have lost their parents have a right to be adopted. Okay? It is the child's needs and desires and rights that are central to whether or not a placement takes place. Now, there is another extreme that's also taking place, and that is an adult-centric focus when it comes to child relinquishment. So Naomi Riley Schaefer is doing the best work on this at American Enterprise Institute, where now sometimes children are remaining with abusive or neglectful biological parents for too long, because instead of having a child-centric mentality, the adults, even in the family of origin, who have not proven themselves to be safe options, continue to retain custody of their children. And unfortunately, we now have a lot of cases of children who should have been removed and weren't. This is often done under the guise of children should not be removed. Minority children should never be placed with, parents who are white or parents who are of another race, and instead are left in these very harmful situations. So in both of those areas, the rights of the child is not being elevated. True child-centric adoption is always going to look at the best interest of the child and not what the adults want out of the situation.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I know there's like a Black social worker network that has like publicly written and declared that Black children should not be placed with white families. Like, it's like openly racist.
Yes, that's right.
And I remember, and I read that, I was like, this gotta be like a fringe group, but it's actually not. Yeah. Like, it's a mainstream thought that a lot of social workers who are Black feel. It was crazy when I stumbled across that. I mean, how does that relate to then the foster care, situations? Yeah. I mean, you kind of just hit upon it, right? When children are being left in homes in situations where normally the state would have come in to protect the rights of the child, but they're being left in a dangerous situation because they don't have a couple of the child's color that can take that child into their home.
Yeah, there's all kinds of problems if we start to replace anything with the best interest of the child as the ultimate aim of adoption. Whether we're replacing that with this is a way for adults to get kids, or adults have a right to adopt, or it's racist to place kids. I mean, you put anything else up there other than the best interest of the child, and children are victimized. And that is what we're seeing here. Yeah. And so that is a major, major problem, because ideology is now superseding the actual well-being of kids. And you do get a body count from that. Children are abused and they die because they are not removed from homes where there are obvious red flags in terms of neglect and abuse. So it's not just among Black social workers. Unfortunately, this ideology has captured different social welfare departments, and they are hesitant to place children with safe, loving, vetted homes if they are not the same race. Now, that's a problem because there are...
Well, like Washington State now, I think it's like, or it was one of the ones up Northwest where, like, if you're a Christian family, you're like off limits now for fostering children because you don't subscribe to the state's view on radical gender ideology.
That's right. So again, that's where you see ideology is superseding the best interest of the child, right? Your ideology about what you think the world should look like in terms of sex and gender and transgender treatments and, children's right to puberty blocking hormones that are going to sterilize them or whatever it is. When that supersedes the well-being of the kids, what does that mean? That means that Christian parents who recognize the goodness of the male-female body, the complementary ways that they unite to maximize child development, that same mentality that leads Christians to say, we actually believe in lifelong heterosexual marriage. We don't think that you should transition children in ways that degrade the function of their body, either chemically or surgically. That same worldview also leads twice as many Christians to adopt as the general population. Okay. So when your ideology about sex and gender supersedes the well-being of the kids, you actually knock out a huge pool of people who are willing to graft these needy children into their homes for life. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if best interest of the child is not the highest aim, children are going to be the victims. And we're seeing that in a lot of different ways when it comes to foster care and adoption.
I mean, I'm not sure, maybe you probably know this, the case in Philadelphia against the Catholic Adoption Agency in Philadelphia, where the city sued the Catholic Adoption Agency because they weren't adopting children, placing children with same-sex couples. And so, like, the city would rather have a Catholic adoption agency that's existed for decades shut down. Like, it was crazy. Like, what happened? Do you know what's going on with that case?
Well, so it's interesting because I believe that they won. They were victorious. But very soon after that, one of the largest Christian adoption agencies in the country, Bethany Adoption, compromised. And they said, we're now going to place kids with same-sex couples. Now, personally, I understand that sometimes you don't have enough loving, heterosexual, married Christian couples to adopt all of the kids, especially the sibling groups, the older kids, the kids with special needs, right? Let's be honest. There are years-long waiting lists for white drug-free infants. There are.
Yeah.
But there's not enough adults. There are not enough people who are willing to open their homes to the kids who are hard cases. And to me, my response is not to criticize the single parents or the same-sex parents who are taking in the cases that you don't want. My solution is go get those kids. Go get those kids. If you think that kids should have a mother and father, you're concerned that social workers are placing kids with same-sex couples, you go get them. And it's costly. But guess what? That is what the world of children's rights demands. It demands that adults do hard things on behalf of kids, because the only alternative is for kids to do hard things on behalf of adults. And that is not a recipe for a just society. And that, we see that primarily played out in the pro-life world, in the anti-abortion work that you guys are busy with. That same mentality is also true in the marriage and family world. Someone's going to do the hard thing. Is the kid going to lose their right to life so the adults can live as they please? Or are the adults going to bend their lives in a way that protects the child's right to life? That's hard. Same thing in the marriage and family debate that we talk about with all these forms of modern families. Someone is going to do the hard thing. Is it going to be the adults who have to bend their life around the rights and well-being of kids? Or is it going to be the child who has to lose their mother or father to be in that family structure?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, someone has to do the hard thing, and it should be the adult. You mentioned, just to back up the conversation, you mentioned it's costly. What is the average cost for adoption here in the United States? And what is contributing to these high adoption costs that we can come in and fix? Or should we even fix that? I've always subscribed to the thought that, adoption shouldn't be expensive, but then I learned about a year ago that some people, even in the pro-life movement, deeply disagree, and they think it should be more expensive. So that was a new thought process that I hadn't been aware of. What's your feeling on that?
Well, as somebody who worked at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world, as an adoptive parent myself, as a woman who understands that adoption is an institution that's centered around the well-being of children, and it is a just society's response to children who have lost their parents. Okay, adoption is what a just society will do if children don't have a mom or dad. Okay, so I am a fan of adoption. We talk about the cost of adoption as if there is a problem with that, and it is hard. Like my husband and I went through our adoption when we didn't have enough money in our bank account to pay for the cost of the adoption. We had to just move forward trusting that the money was going to come. So it is expensive and it is burdensome. But it's actually a really important contrast between adoption and reproductive technologies, because a lot of people will say, well, in reproductive technologies, you're paying a lot for a kid, IVF or a sperm donor or egg donor or a surrogate. Adoption costs a lot of money too. I mean, there's no difference. Here's the difference. There's a major difference. And actually the cost points out some of the biggest differences. In adoption, it is prohibited. A lot of people say, well, you're buying a baby. We say you're buying a baby with big fertility. And they'll say, well, you're buying a baby with adoption. Here's the difference. With adoption, you know what our money went to? It went to the state of Washington, our adoption agency, the federal government, and the Chinese government, all screening and vetting us. Background checks, home studies, references, physical exams, financial forms, post-placement reports, everything to make sure that we are going to care for and love that child as if they were born to us. It is illegal for the money that we spend on the adoption to go to the birth parents or the birth family. That is considered child trafficking. All of the costs that are built into adoption is in essence to vet us to make sure that we are not going to abuse this child. It is the exact opposite with big fertility.
Yeah, I would say, didn't you just define what happens in surrogacy?
So in surrogacy, you pay the birth parents. You pay the woman that's gestating the child. You pay the person who's contributing the egg.
How is that not child trafficking?
It is child trafficking. I mean, so that is what I'm saying, that big fertility is the inverse of the best practice of adoption in nearly every way. The only similarity between the two is that children are raised by unrelated adults. That's the only similarity, right? But in the adoption situation, you have adults doing hard things on behalf of kids. In big fertility, you have kids doing hard things on behalf of adults. In adoption, money never goes to the birth family. Big fertility is built on money going directly to the genetic parents, right? In adoption, there's screening, vetting, background checks. In big fertility, the only check that clears is the check at the bank. We already have stories of people creating children through big fertility that would never have passed an adoption background check, right? In adoption, the goal is to place every child with a loving home, regardless, some adults won't get a kid. In big fertility, the goal is to get every adult a child, no matter the cost to that kid or any other kid. So adoption is an institution centered around the best interest of the child. Reproductive technologies is a marketplace centered around the desires of adults. Both of them involve money, but the money does very, very different things.
That's unbelievable. I never thought of setting it up that way. I mean, none of the money in adoption is going to the birth mother, because that's considered child trafficking. Yet in IVF, all the money's going to the genetic parents, right, whether it's paying for egg or sperm or gestating the child. But no one's ever, I don't think I've ever heard anyone compare it like that. I think that's extremely important to think about the two, IVF versus adoption. And you're right, there is no screening of parents. I mean, what is out there? Like, what are the regulations, I guess, in the IVF industry, in the vitro fertilization industry? So you just said there's no, unlike with adoption and foster care, there's no screening of the potential parents, to whether or not they would have a loving and safe home, a stable home for children. What else is, I guess, the industry lacking in regulation of?
There's very few regulations. I mean, it would be better to talk about the few ways that it is regulated. Most of these fertility companies, they don't even have to report like what they do with their unused embryos. So it's very hard to get numbers on what they're actually doing with these little lives. Okay. So like, for example, I did some advocacy in South Dakota against a commercial surrogacy bill, and the people that are on the ground there, the pro-lifers, they tried to pass a bill that just said, just tell us, we're not even trying to regulate what you're doing with these surplus embryos. Just tell us what you're doing with them. How many of them are being donated to research? How many of them are being thawed and discarded? How many of them are still in a freezer? How many of them actually gestate and make it? How many of them are selectively reduced in terms of aborted, right? And they wouldn't even allow laws to be passed to monitor what they are doing with these little lives. And so
this was in South Dakota?
This is South Dakota, right? Which
like a Republican state.
Well, why South Dakota? They've got big fertility industries there. The fertility industries tend to move to places that have more economically vulnerable women, right? Because those are the women that tend to want to get their wombs out. And it's a very business-friendly state. And so they have made several pushes for commercial surrogacy there. It's very, very important. I know that a lot of the people that are listening to this right now are going, how could you go after IVF? How could you do that? Right? We love babies. This is the way for infertile couples to have babies. Well, I would like to let your audience know, and anybody that's actually gone through the IVF process can fact check me on this. And that is that only 7% of babies created in a laboratory, that is IVF in vitro, in glass, only 7% will be born alive. 93% of babies created through IVF will not be born alive. They're either going to be deemed to be, they won't make the grade and they will be discarded at like day 3 to 5. They'll be deemed surplus embryos and frozen. And we've got 100,000 frozen embryos on ice right now. Most of those kids are never, ever going to make it out of the freezer. Okay. Many of them that are unwanted or surplus will be donated to research. Right. And so, and a lot of times that research is used to then improve fertility, like kill little lives, so that you can make better little lives in the future, in essence, right? And then, of course, abortion functions as quality control and quantity control, especially in surrogacy arrangements. When you're paying 6 figures for a baby, you want the exact baby you ordered at exactly the time that you ordered it and nothing else. So a lot of, and if you've gone through this IVF process, and if you did it in a way that did not discard any unborn lives, you know that you had to fight your doctor the entire way, didn't you? That is not how their business model typically works. And then another thing that I bring up is after Dobbs, you had fertility doctors in red states panicking because if we defined life as beginning in conception, they literally said, we cannot do business in this state. We cannot have
several of them did. I mean, it's astounding that when pushed, the IVF industry, even the hormonal birth control industry will admit these things. So if you pass a personhood bill, defining that, science proves life begins at conception, that, this is the argument we've been saying for years is, hey, hormonal birth control can be abortifacient. Everyone says you're lying until you try to introduce a personhood law in the state, and then the abortion industry themselves admit to what you're saying. It's the same thing with IVF.
So anyway,
it's unbelievable.
I know that IVF is a very sensitive subject because infertility.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about, Katie. Is how do you have this conversation? I mean, we have Students for Life leaders who were conceived via IVF. Mm-hmm. We have supporters at Students for Life who've used IVF to get pregnant, and have these beautiful children who are valuable. How do you have a compassionate conversation with somebody who may be struggling with infertility about the dangers of IVF? Because yes, we know the facts. IVF, what you just said, only 7% of children created during in vitro fertilization are actually ever born. 93% are killed. That's staggering. Yes, it's human trafficking, child trafficking. We've established that. How do you have that compassionate conversation? What are your best suggestions?
Well, you have to do two things. Number one, you have to be an expert. You actually have to know these things. And so you and I can and should have a very frank conversation about this on your podcast so that people know what's going on. And what's going on is the baby making industry takes more embryonic lives every year than the baby taking industry. So first of all, you need to be very clear that IVF is not pro-life in general, right?
That's right.
So you have to know the facts. And we cannot say in the name of compassion or in the name of empathy, we're not even going to talk about this because lives are at stake. So you and I can and should have this frank conversation. But then what do you do with your friend who's suffering? What do you do with your friend who's struggling? And that is, you lead with empathy. You lead with compassion. You seek to bear their burden. It's exactly what all of you guys already do for women in unplanned pregnancy situations. You have practiced this muscle before. You understand how to genuinely throw your arms around a woman who is struggling in something that is going to affect her entire life. But then you say to her, but no amount of your fear, your loss, your sadness, your shock at this development, none of that justifies violating a child's right to life. Yeah. You take that same tactic, and it's not a tactic. It is just the way you should interact to somebody struggling with infertility. And you say, I understand you feel like your heart is broken every single month. I'm going to walk with you through this. I'm going to cheer you on. I am going to be your girl. No amount of your loss, your longing, your hopes justify violating a child's right to life. Right? So it's the same thing. We must empathize. We must bear the burden of the women, especially in our life. But if we genuinely are pro-life, we have to fight for life on both of these fronts.
Well, this has been an outstanding conversation. I mean, the fact the truth bomb you just dropped of the baby making, industry takes more lives than the baby taking industry every year. I mean, it's unbelievable to think about that. It's staggering and overwhelming. But I do think it is important to have this conversation, which is why I wanted to have you on today to start having this conversation about a child's rights based approach to adoption and infertility, because you are absolutely right. The child is just completely left out of the conversation. So I'm going to give you a minute. Give me your final thoughts, what you want every listener of the podcast to think about, take home, do, and where can they find more information? Because I have a feeling there's a lot more information that we didn't cover today that they need to find out from you.
Well, I often talk about how anti-abortion work is children's rights 1.0. Children's right to life is a fundamental right. And it's critical. It's worth having hundreds of organizations out there defending children's right to life. And, it's so important to support your work and your organization because you are doing that in ways that is so critical for very real little lives. But marriage and family, as it relates to marriage and family building, is children's rights 2.0, right? We don't need to just defend children's rights in the womb. We need to defend children's rights on this side of the womb. And marriage and family is how we do that, whether you're talking about building your family and how we look at technologies, whether we're talking about laws around marriage and, parenthood, whether we're looking at cultural ideas about love makes a family or biology doesn't matter or whatever it is, kids don't need moms and dads. They just need to be safe and loved, blah, 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 right? all of these different areas really are the place where we need to have children's rights 2.0. And that's what Them Before Us is. We are the only organization solely devoted to defending children's rights in marriage and family issues. And we use a lot of the same tactics that have won this country over in so many ways to be overwhelmingly pro-life, especially in the younger generations. So there is a lot to learn. We have a book that will make you an expert. It's called Them Before Us, Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement. We just started a podcast that audibly goes through all of those chapters. So if you're an Audible learner, podcast for you. Come to our website, subscribe. We have so much coming up in the next couple months and years, and we'd love for you to be a part of it.
That's awesome. Thank you, Katie, so much for stepping up and embarking on this mission. I can't wait to continue to follow your journey, and hopefully our work collides more and more in the coming years as we stand up for the most vulnerable in our world, our little children, our little boys and girls. And thank you all for tuning in today to this very special episode of Explicitly Pro-Life Podcast. This was an illuminating conversation for me, so I hope it was for you as well. Please make sure you share this episode and follow Them Before Us. Bye, everyone.